Hey everyone, welcome to another week of ProMAX Tech Talks. I'm Matt. I'm here with Brian, Taylor, and Mike. And this week we're going to be talking about all things motion graphics, from the different types of graphics and how to build out a workflow that's going to be able to support that for you. So guys, let's just get started with a very broad overview. Mike, we'll start with you. What are motion graphics and what are they typically used for in a video production workflow?
So motion graphics can be anything like infographic, or even just like flying logos everywhere. You can do like lower thirds, or even just a general insertion of logos as far as basics go. But you can go pretty much advanced from there and start compositing with certain animations on top of that, and certain various ways of inserting your icons, essentially, or your variables, I should say.
Okay, so you mentioned there's different levels to it. There's a couple different types of like a spectrum that people can work on in that. Brian, you want to touch on what the different types of motion graphics are?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty subjective, but in general, when you talk about motion graphics, the thing that pops to my mind, having worked in this stuff for a long time, is stuff like Mike mentioned, like we used to call it flying logos and stuff, like animated branding, simple animations that maybe don't. They used to not be like, the definition used to literally be like not truly 3D, but that's changed actually over the last several years. Adobe and a lot of these other motion graphic capable programs kind of have given you the ability to add depth and stuff and actual real lighting to some motion graphics projects, which is pretty cool. But so you can get pretty creative doing logos, things like that. Again, lower thirds, flying stuff. Like, probably one of the more complex ways to think about it is a lot of, weirdly enough, a lot of like 2D animation is actually done in like After Effects type platforms and stuff these days. Like, you look at the end of some movies, like some Disney movies and stuff, and the Marvel movies have like the animated, like wacky animated stuff happening during the credit rolls and stuff like that. That's kind of 2D and stuff. And even that can be considered like a motion graphics thing, although it kind of borders on animation. Yeah, it's a super wide, all-encompassing kind of term for anything that's not like true life video, and everything that's not like hardcore 3D animation type stuff kind of falls into that motion graphics category.
Okay, thanks guys. So what kind of tools is someone who's going to be creating these types of graphics going to need? Like from the workstation they're using to the software they're using, what do you need to be able to make this kind of workflow work?
Mike?
So with software, most users will be using After Effects. That's generally the main tool everyone uses. Some users, very rare nowadays, uses Motion. I don't even know if that's in production anymore. To be honest, is that not? Okay.
No.
I was using Motion,
but I used it.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember.
It was pretty good. It was fantastic. I was on like a 2009 MacBook Pro, so
Came in that box.
yeah, that box right over there. I think it was like a package deal too.
Yeah.
Like, you had like Final Cut and everything.
It was.
So that was when like the unibodies first came out. So you can use that. What was the other ones? Wasn't there one that was called like Coffee or something? Visual Coffee?
There was a bunch of plugins. Maybe this is where you're going. There was a bunch of plugins for After Effects called Mocha.
Yeah.
That involved, that was kind of the first, or at least the most commercially successful, like automated rotoscoping, which kind of changed the game for a lot of folks. I know I bought the first couple versions of that because it was awesome. But yeah, that was a while ago. Now that's largely built into, all that functionality is largely built into most of the platforms.
Back then, Red Giant had a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, those are all
plugins. They still around? I don't even touch this stuff.
Is what?
Are they still around?
Yeah, and those are plugin companies that, like, they used to do. Red Giant did a bunch of plugins. Probably where I ran into them the most is they did a bunch of motion graphics plugins for Avid. Avid had a motion graphics platform, and I can't remember what the heck it was called. But it bundled with their Media Composer software and their Symphony software several years ago. But it was all, to what you're saying, it was all to the same end. It was all basically After Effects-ish keyframe vector graphic type animation, 2D animation is where it all kind of based around.
Nowadays, everyone does 3D tracking nowadays.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, After Effects is like,
The
I'm
standard.
gonna totally spitball a number here, but it's got to be in the 90% market share for motion graphics stuff. Like more so than even like Premiere Pro. I think they have a lock on that particular product, probably more than anything. There's arguments that you can do stuff in Final Cut X or Avid Media Composer or DaVinci Resolve versus Premiere Pro, but man, when you're doing motion graphics work, it's pretty much After Effects or bust these days.
And is it just because of the feature set they have, or is there other reasons why After Effects is just that go-to software?
I think it's features and just it's what everybody has come up with. It's what everybody literally has come up through the ranks with, and what students are being taught on. There just hasn't been. It's such a, to the point we made earlier, it's such a wide range of tools and tool sets that there are other programs that might do certain aspects of motion graphics better, or or a little bit nicer. Like there's certain things like Blender is one that pops up every now and then for motion graphic stuff that's a little more complex in the 3D world, stuff like that. But as a single universal tool, it's so After Effects is such an expansive program at this point and covers so many capabilities that it probably isn't going to be dethroned for a while.
Okay. So when you're working with motion graphics, obviously there's going to be some strain on your system. So what kind of hardware considerations should you be looking at if you're going to be working in this kind of workflow? Is there like a minimum threshold that you need to be able to hit with certain aspects of your workstation performance, or what does that look like?
Taylor?
So typically, specifically working with After Effects, your main performance number you're going to be looking for is processor clock speed. So it used to be, the only exception to that is if you're working with like a Cinema 4D plugin to do some like 3D motion graphics, that will benefit a bit more from a larger core count or a GPU. But the vast majority of rendering done in After Effects is going to be based on clock speed at this point.
So can you elaborate a little bit more on what clock speed is?
So clock speed is basically the speed of each individual core on the processor. So you can pretty much get two kinds of processors, ones that have a lot of cores or ones that are very fast per core. It's gotten pretty close nowadays, and you can get systems with basically the best of both. But it's going to cost you a premium because each one of those factors is a bit more expensive. Intel tends to play more on the low core count, higher clock speed, and AMD is more on the range of the larger core count, lower clock speed, more threads for processing versus faster processing of each thread.
And is there one that you would recommend over the other, or are both pretty equal? And
for After Effects, if you're not doing 3D graphics and stuff with Cinema 4D, you're probably going to want to go with a high clock speed Intel.
Okay, cool. So let's backtrack a little bit. There's another question I wanted to ask you guys when we were talking about the different types of motion graphics. So we talked about animation and kind of the flying logos kind of stuff. What's the main difference on on how your workstation needs to process that kind of stuff? Is there a big difference, or is it just the files are going to be a little bit bigger if you're doing a more advanced animation graphic compared to a flying logo?
I mean, you managed to get me to say it again. It depends on your workflow.
That's my job.
It really comes down to how you're working with it. I mean, After Effects is one of those is one of the programs where really having a lot of memory actually is quite beneficial, because they do a lot of in-memory kind of pre-rendering that goes on. Because really, when you get down to it, the bulk of After Effects is kind of vector-based 3D type animation, and it's being generated on the fly, and that information can be kind of pre-rendered and stacked into memory, and you can do some playback in your memory cache. That said, if you're doing more 3D type work, and depending on what renderers you're using and a lot of other variables, you know, a high-end video card that can do real-time ray tracing, things like that can go a long way. It doesn't work for every workflow, like what Taylor's referring to when he's talking about the CPU speeds and stuff. Is the lowest common denominator with all this stuff is, you know, when you hit render, if the GPU can't do it and you don't have enough memory to kind of cache it up, CPU is going to do it. It's always going to fall back on the CPU. So in general, the faster CPU that you have, the better clock speed that you have, and the decent number of cores. I mean, After Effects is pretty well threaded at this point. But the better CPU that you have, your baseline performance is just going to be higher. You know, again, depending on plugins and stuff, if you use particular plugins and renderers that really favor ray tracing, a high-end video card will go a long way. But ultimately, you know, when you render the portion of that scene or whatnot that doesn't require ray tracing, it's falling back to the CPU. So that's always kind of your baseline, and it's a good place to start to make sure that you've got everything, you know, in line with a solid workstation, because you don't want you don't want to hit a part where you're not doing ray tracing rendering and now it's falling back on the CPU and now your render time just jumped up 45 minutes like that. That's no fun. But it totally depends on what you're rendering and what you're doing. But
Okay.
yeah.
Do you ray tracing? That's something I've never heard you guys mention before. Can you elaborate? Like, just give us like the short version of what that means.
There are different rendering engines that basically rendering is effectively, I'm going to butcher this, but the short version of rendering is that you're simulating physical objects and the light interaction with physical objects to result in a picture. So like if you've got a 3D cube, you're simulating the light, the refraction, the lighting refraction, the ambient occlusion, stuff like that, that gives you a real looking 3D cube. Ray tracing is a method, a very popular method where a lot of rendering engines, which dictate how those calculations are all made, use to generate the end result. There's a lot of different engines, and some of them use different versions of ray tracing. But because ray tracing is a fairly common core kind of instructional set for these engines, you know, a lot of newer graphics cards have been able to kind of pre-bake those instructions into actual hardware, which means, you know, anytime you execute something over like a hardware pipeline versus a software pipeline, hardware is going to beat it 100% of the time. So if you can kind of bake that into the hardware, now suddenly, you know, you can ray trace stuff a lot faster and you get a much more realistic look than something that is potentially not ray traced. Like the lighting just kind of falls better onto everything. I'm leaving out a million things involving render engines, so I'm like borderline embarrassed about that, but that's kind of the base, the basic explanation.
Okay, cool. And then, you know, we were talking earlier about how to get the best bang for your buck when building out one of these workflows. Do you want to take us down that road? Like, how do you get the best system without blowing your budget when building these out, especially if you're going to be doing motion graphics?
Yeah, I would say, you know, I mentioned this a bit ago, but one of the things that you do want to kind of splurge on a little bit in a motion graphics focused workstation is RAM. You know, a lot of programs really don't require, you can get away with 16, 32 gigs of RAM, you know, in most systems these days for fairly high-end stuff. But when you got motion graphics, it's not crazy to go, you know, 64, certainly 64. I would say minimum 64. And you know, up into 128 and higher in some systems if you can afford it. It really does help because so much stuff is cached into memory when you're doing these motion graphics previews and stuff. It really helps get real-time playback or close to real-time playback, so you can kind of zero in on what you're doing, especially with larger compositions. But you know, in general, a motion graphics workstation is probably one of the higher, like the base level of where that needs to be is probably higher end than just about anything outside of maybe like a particle simulation type workflow for true 3D graphics. That's probably one of the most demanding that I can think of. Physics simulation, but in general, you need a certainly mid to high end processor, probably high mid to high end processor, 64 gigs of RAM, and if not a quadro card, a very high end, GTX, RTX type card, video card to leverage, the ray trace renders, things like that can actually utilize GPU. You don't. So much of that really does happen. You don't want to be without. You need something good in that regard.
Okay, so final question on that then. Are there any workstations that you can just go out and buy that'll fit that bill? Or is this something that you're going to have to go out, buy a base model, and then do some internal upgrades to?
I mean, there's the obvious ones. You've got the high-end Dell workstations, the high-end HP workstations, the Z800 type series, some of the more finely tuned Z600 type series. But you can do a lot of damage in motion graphics with what would be considered a high-end gaming machine. They all, there's a stigma to it, of course, but they all share the same principles, which is, you want graphics performance, and whether that's rendering a game or a commercial project, there's frankly not a huge difference between the two. It's gross generalization, but ultimately, like I said, you can go, if you had to, you could go grab a $2,000 machine from Best Buy or something like that, and probably fare relatively well in the motion graphics world, until you really got complex. I wouldn't recommend that, but you could.
All right, fair enough. So then before we wrap this all up, were there anything else that you guys think is important that we should be talking about in regards to motion graphics? Or I feel like we've covered a lot of the stuff that goes into that. Mike?
If you're going to build something, make sure to plan it out, because you can bottleneck yourself really easily depending on what components you use. Especially depending on processor, depending on board, you can limit yourself on, like, I did it to myself. I bought a mini ATX board, and I should have bought a design air board in the first place to get more lanes, more growth out of that. Cooling is going to be a major thing. All the new i9 processors get really hot, so you got to really cool those down, especially if you're going to do motion graphics. You're going to be beating it up, so cooling's a factor. Cases, there's so much into it that we can go on for, like, I think Brian and I, we talked like 3 or 4 hours just building stuff.
Yeah, well, building workstations is fun. Yeah, there's a lot of nuance to it for sure. And again, it depends what you're doing. There's differences if you really want to dial it in. When we talk about motion graphics, there's other kind of facets of that, or things that are even similar to that. You've got compositing, you've got motion graphics, you've got you've got true 3D animation, and they each have certain things that are more useful than others. You can build a generalist box pretty easily, but if you want to get crazy, like I said, into like real-time physics, particle simulation type stuff, there's different places to go, and it all kind of falls under motion graphics in a very general way, but that's kind of more animation, I guess.
Okay. Taylor, we were closing today's tech talk out with if there was anything else you think we should be talking about. Mike was talking about some of the components, making sure you're cooling, making sure you have the right board. Do you have anything else that you think we should be talking about around this kind of stuff, or do you think we covered everything?
No, I think we pretty much touched on everything.
All right. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for this week's Tech Talk. If you have any questions for a future episode, feel free to send them to us. If you're not already, follow our page and subscribe to our channel below. We look forward to talking to you next week. Have a great one. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.